It's time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good afternoon, all, I should say. Al, I'm going to start with you. And it was pretty remarkable last week when the House Democrats finally came together to pass President Biden's $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill. And thanks to the Biden team and Speaker Pelosi's leadership, that certainly gave me the impression that sausage could still be made in Washington. But is this enough to save the 2022 midterms for the Democrats and move Biden's favorability from its all-time low at about 38%?
Well, it's a terrific victory, and I'm glad it's passed, but I wouldn't put much money on it changing the fate of the Democrats in 2022. I think three things have to happen to even have a chance at that. One is the voters just have to feel a lot better about the way the country's going. And right now they're in a sour mood. And when they're in a sour mood, they take it out on the party in the White House. And that's why his approval ratings are at 38%. Second, the Democrats really have to redefine themselves again and move back to the center. I mean, no less a progressive pillar than the New York Times last week editorialized that Biden had to get back to the moderate ideas and values that helped Democrats win the House in 2018 and Biden win the presidency. They reminded him that he didn't promise a progressive revolution. There were other candidates in the race who did that, and he beat them back badly. And they also need to demonstrate as part of that, getting back to the center, that they're listening to the voters. I mean, the voters are now telling them that the issues that are driving politics are likely to be inflation and crime. The voters are back to their normal aversion to big government. Inflation in particular, I mean, people feel that every time they go to the gas station, they go to the grocery store. This morning we had the report out that inflation is at a 30-year high. So it's going up, not going down. And even with the tight labor markets, real wages are down for the last year. And the third thing they have to do is they really need to get a lot of help from the Republicans. So can the infrastructure bill help? Yes, but he needs to really use it to jumpstart his administration and, in effect, to get it back to a new beginning. I hope, and I think he's going to do this, he's going to have a bipartisan signing ceremony. I think he ought to really try to promote this as an example of the country, that we can get past our gridlock, that we can change the tone in American politics. To be honest with you, in the short term, that's more important than trying to brag about the economic benefits, because they'll happen. And as Craig and I have talked about all year, they're really important, but they take a long time. So what are some of the things he ought to do? He needs to follow that up with, I think it's time, he's got to go back to the drawing board on the reconciliation bill. He needs to scrub it for inflation. And I believe if I were advising him, I'd say you pull out all but your 2 or 3 highest priorities and take the rest of it, send them back up to Congress as individual bills, but really make it as inflation-proof as possible, because if they continue with a big bill, even at $1.75 trillion, you're putting a big fat target up there for the Republicans, and the Republicans aren't going to miss it next year. I think we're never going to get the country out of the sour mood until we end the pandemic. And there's only one way to do it. We got to get everybody we can vaccinated. Let the Republicans scream about it if they want. The anti-mandate folks. I mean, I saw something that at least in recent months, deaths from COVID are 5 times as great in the red states that are basically more unvaccinated than in the blue states where they're vaccinated. And the final thing that has to happen is the Republicans have to pitch in and help, and they can do it. I mean, the Republican reaction to the bipartisan infrastructure bill in the House, where a bunch of their members are trying to punish the 13 Republicans who voted for it, take away their committees, and they're getting death threats for their families. One of the members from Arizona posted a video showing that him killing AOC, another member of Congress, and slashing Joe Biden, President Biden. They continue that nonsense. Everybody in the country, all the voters may not know about it, but I'll tell you who does know about it. People who would like to run as Republicans next year. And we saw that yesterday. Chris Sununu, who probably gave them the best chance they could have of winning a Senate seat in New Hampshire against Maggie Hassan, said, I'm not going to do this. I don't need this grief. I'm going to run for governor again. Just to sum up, all of that could happen. And when the average loss of the party in power is 27 seats in the House and 4 in the Senate, in a midterm election, you know, the hole is probably too deep to get out of.
Craig, turning it over to you. I mean, do you share that sobering remark by Al on this?
It's just a whole lot going on. And I tried to spend the week stepping back a little bit and reflecting on, okay, what happened both with the elections and also with this legislative initiative. Al mentioned the fact that there were 13 Republicans in the House that came in to vote for in the infrastructure bill. Of course, this is a bill Republicans in the Senate supported, so this is not, earth-shattering in and of itself. And infrastructure was always supposed to be the legislation that would enjoy bipartisan support. One of the little tactical things that was interesting that occurred was that those votes came relatively early during the vote counting. So Democrats knew right away they had the votes to pass this with those 13. They didn't need all 13. And it did give a chance for some who, for whatever reason, wanted to get off and vote against the bill to do it, knowing that they weren't going to torpedo the initiative. But it tells us something about the degree of difficulty of doing business in this Congress. And I kind of always think about it in thirds. For almost any proposal, you used to generally have about a third of the votes you could count on getting, a third probably you could count on not getting, and it's those third in the middle that you really had to kind of develop a strategy around to figure out how you could win over enough to get to a majority without losing the base. And this is something Al and I practiced for many years. The problem is, and a Pew Research study came out where it breaks up kind of Republican leaning voters into 4 categories, Democratic leaning voters into 4 categories, and then has a ninth, a final category of the sort of the frustrated sidelined individuals. That analysis, and I'm not going to try to go through it here, but that analysis shows just how complex it is. Not only are there deep divides between the two parties, I mean, stark contrast between the way the people think about issues depending on whether they align themselves or lean Republican or Democrat. But within the parties, there's deep differences on very specific issues. So taking that 1/3 in the middle and trying to figure out how you parse out enough to get to a majority has become much more difficult. I think one of the things the country is dealing with are just unmet expectations. I think voters thought that a Democratic president, a Democratic House leader, a Senate leader would suddenly get things done in Washington. But of course, it turns out that finding the path to sufficient votes to pass things is much more difficult than it's been. And as Al was pointing out, it's going to stay very difficult. And again, remember, infrastructure was the bipartisan legislation. So I think you definitely have to pivot. You definitely, President and his administration definitely has to recalculate how you put wins on the board so that you can go into an election year with some victories. And frankly, from my party's standpoint, I'd like to see them find some positive pathway. Just bashing members of their own party who, show up and vote, doesn't seem like a very prudent path forward. And it certainly doesn't exhibit much leadership. You know, they're punishing people, or they're calling for the punishment of people who showed up and exercised their constitutional responsibility, and yet they seem to look the other way on things that occurred on January 6th. So it's a very difficult place in which to do business. But you know, I've used the phrase before: a president's either putting political capital in his bank account or taking it out. Biden has had to take a lot out to get a little bit done. He can now put a little bit back, but he really has to find a path forward where voters see some success and begin to feel the results of what's happening in Washington. And I think we're just reflecting for a minute on the election in Virginia, particularly. I think that anybody running for office must do a better job of figuring out how to talk to the voters and relate to them in a way that the voter believes that person seeking office understands the kinds of issues they're facing. And I don't think either party is doing a particularly good job of that. But I do think that that's probably going to have a greater impact next year than anything. And lastly, I'd say, I don't know. I mean, Al and I have had a pretty good track record on our prognostications, but I think 2022 is more up for grabs than people might think. If there is a sense that Washington leadership has come together to do things, that'll accrue to the great benefit, certainly, of the Democratic leadership. If the flailing continues, then I imagine voters will say, let's have a change. Let's see what somebody else can do. And that seems to be the path we're on. So I see a lot of volatility in the political scene next year. And about the only thing a sitting administration can do is get things done and demonstrate their ability to be successful with Congress, strengthen the economy, as Al says, deal with the COVID crisis. If those things happen, their prospects could look considerably better than we might think right now.
Compliment you, Al. I think you and Larry Summers were the only ones who were waving the inflation flag a couple of months ago. It is one of those things that I don't believe the Biden administration was fully recognizing as they were going into these political battles. How do you fix inflation? You can't by 2022. I mean, it's just going to be a challenge for anybody.
That's right. And the reason I'm so sensitive to it is because Craig and Ronald Reagan beat me over the head with it when I was deputy advisor to President Carter on inflation. And the people feel it. I mean, when prices go up 6% and your wages go up 5%, you're working harder. You think you're getting a deal because you got a good raise, and you're falling back. And the administration needs to be sensitive to that. Washington interest groups aren't, because they look at the unemployment rate, which is, I think, an increasingly poor indicator of the state of the economy. I mean, obviously you want low unemployment, but what we really want is high employment with high real wages. Because part of the reason the unemployment rate goes down is because fewer people are looking for jobs, and they just pull out of the market. What I was really saying is not to sort of reassess and pull back, and not offer your initiatives, but to victories are important, but if you have a win and the outcome for the voters is that they think you're hurting their prospects rather than helping it, it doesn't help you with the voters. And there's no bigger target on the issue of inflation than a big, expansive government spending bill. And it is not hard for the president to say, okay, we're gonna sort of reassess where we are. We've got one of the ways you make people understand you're aware of it is you get people angry, and some in your own party, so they notice it. And you say, okay, we're going to pull back. We're going to make sure this bill funds the government. We're going to make sure that these two highest priorities of my administration are done, but we're going to avoid increasing inflation. But these other priorities that you want are important too. So I'm going to send them back up to Congress and we can consider them in the normal order, individually. We can build constituencies for them. So I think that's important. I just want to say one other thing about, people may not understand how the significance of this effort to punish people because of their votes. I was head of the House Democratic Caucus during the first Reagan term, and we had a couple of members, Phil Graham and Kent Hance, who worked with Reagan on the budget and tax bill. And we held a caucus because members in our party wanted to punish them. And I personally, because it was my job, I researched every precedent in the Congress, in the history of the Democratic Caucus, which is the oldest institution in the Congress except for the speakership, to look at for times that members were punished. And the precedents are clear. Members are never punished because of their votes representing their constituencies. They're punished because they do things that are against the interest of their political party, and it's like endorse a candidate of the other party for a congressional seat or something like that. But anyway, so for most people that may not be a big deal, but some of those things are the things that keep our democracy strong and keep our two-party system working in the right way and make it possible for people to work across party lines to actually do progress for the country.
Craig, you have the last word this week.
Let me pick up on that last point that Al was making, because I totally agree. And it's long been accepted that, if today I can't join and vote with my caucus on something, I shouldn't be attacked, because guess what? Next week, they're going to need my vote on something else. And what we're doing is we're eroding the variability of members of the same party to work together and to trust each other. And I'm speaking really of the Republican Party, because I think the style in which, on the House side especially, the style in which the leadership is, and the manner in which it's conducting itself, is just really fraught. And it's another reason why I think there's going to be so much volatility in 2022, where you just can't anticipate things being done or in the way they've been done in the past. And then I'm not sure that's going to be for the good. I think what this place needs in Washington now is, more than ever, is some trust and an ability to work together. And we seem to be going in the opposite direction.
Craig Fuller, Al Fromm, thank you so much. We'll see you next week.